Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the president of Georgetown University and the African Studies program in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, I'm pleased to welcome you here today to the second Oliver Tambo lecture given by His Grace, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We're really privileged to have such a distinguished audience here today. So I want to extend a hearty welcome to members of the U.S. and the Foreign Diplomatic Corps, to members of government and Congress, those of you from Georgetown and from our other fellow universities in the area, those of you from the private sector, from the non-governmental organizations, to the alumni, to the donors, to the friends of the university, and finally to the students of Georgetown, who are here in great number. This Oliver Tambo lecture was designed to acknowledge the university's long-standing commitment to justice and peace in South Africa. We were able to begin the lecture series with funding from the Heinz Corporation, and the inaugural lecture on economic justice in South Africa was given last April by the President of South Africa, President Mbeki. But as we began to envision the second Oliver Tambo lecture, I started to receive some urgent communications from the students, from an emissary of the students, as a matter of fact. It seemed that the students had a proposal, which they strongly urged me to take to the president of the university. And that proposal was that we concur with their decision that Archbishop Desmond Tutu was the single best person to give our second Oliver Tambo lecture. And they suggested that we work together with the Office of the President to make this happen. So I'm pleased to acknowledge that emissary, and she is Sayada Beza, class of 2001. Is she here? I don't need to say much more. I have the honor to introduce you to Ambassador Robert Gallucci, the Dean of the School of Foreign Service, who will introduce our president. Dean Gallucci has served as the Executive Chairman of the UN Special Commission, overseeing disarmament of Iraqis' missiles and weapons of mass destruction in the aftermath of the Persian Gulf War. He has served as U.S. State Department Senior Coordinator for Nonproliferation and Nuclear Safety Initiatives in the former Soviet Union. And then later, he was confirmed as Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. I could go on, but I won't. Dean Gallucci.
In July, just passed, John J. DeGioia became the 48th president of Georgetown University. For more than 2 decades, he has both taught and held leadership positions throughout the university, including Dean of Students and Senior Vice President. He completed his doctorate in philosophy at the university in 1995. Dr. DeGioia was the force behind Georgetown's active engagement in South Africa's struggle for freedom and justice beginning in the late 1980s. At the time, many students and faculty were protesting Georgetown's investments in companies doing business with South Africa. The university ultimately withdrew from those investments. But Dr. DeGioia, who was serving as the Dean of Students, felt the university could extend its commitment to a deeper level. In 5 years, he made 10 trips to South Africa and drew upon the expertise of Georgetown's faculty, including Gwendolyn Michael, Donald McHenry, Herbert Howe, Carol Lancaster, and Ed O'Brien. Dr. DeGioia offered the university's support to Catholic Church leaders, including Smangaliso Patrick Umkashwa, Dennis Hurley, and enlisted recent alumni to teach in Catholic high schools in South Africa. In 1987, Georgetown provided a forum for Oliver Tambo, the exiled leader of the African National Congress, who used this historic hall to call for an end to apartheid. Shortly after his speech, Tambo met for the first time with State Department officials to discuss U.S. sanctions against the repressive South African regime. When democracy began to take hold in South Africa in 1993, Dr. DeGioia helped form a partnership between Georgetown and Howard University to train a new generation of South African diplomats. It gives me great personal pleasure to introduce to you Dr. John DeGioia.
In 1987, the 39th year of apartheid in South Africa, the 23rd year of Nelson Mandela's imprisonment, the 11th year of relegating blacks to their so-called homelands, and the 27th year of his own political exile, African National Congress President Oliver Tambo stepped onto this stage. The words he spoke that day evoked the injustice and brutalization wrought by apartheid and the grim and relentless struggle of its opponents. His words electrified this campus and fueled our desire to be of greater service in South Africa. In the 1980s and 90s, we sent teachers to South Africa. We brought its students to Georgetown, trained its diplomats, and promoted economic opportunity for its people. In those years, Georgetown University was deeply enriched by such engagement, an engagement that we have sought to deepen and renew. Last year, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, President of the Republic of South Africa, delivered the first Oliver Tambo lecture, a compelling message that the economic benefits of globalization must reach impoverished populations in every nation of the world. In July, we honored the inspirational Archbishop Dennis Hurley, who first sounded the call for church opposition to apartheid in 1947 and became a human rights legend among Catholic clergy. And last month, Dr. Mampila Rampele, Managing Director of the World Bank, spoke of the enormous health and economic challenges faced in South Africa and throughout the continent. Much of this dialogue traces its roots to Oliver Tambo's visit to this campus. It is in recognition of his powerful lecture that we gather here today. In every generation, we are blessed with moral and spiritual leaders equal to the challenges of our times. In this generation, we have seen giants, and walking tall among them is Archbishop Desmond Tutu. As a young man, Desmond Tutu trained as a teacher, following in the footsteps of his father. He was soon drawn to theology and was ordained an Anglican priest in 1960. After further study in England, he taught theology for several years, and in 1975, he was named Dean of St. Mary's Cathedral in Johannesburg, the first black man to hold the position. He served as Bishop of Lesotho, and in 1978, became the first black General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches. In 1986, he was named Archbishop of Cape Town, yet the restrictions of apartheid made it a crime for him to live in Bishop's Court, the official residence. Desmond Tutu used his pulpit to educate his nation and the world about the injustice of apartheid and the appalling conditions that resulted from ignorance and discrimination. His eloquent words lifted hearts in the huts of Soweto and stirred moral outrage in corridors of power around the globe. Deeply committed to nonviolence, Bishop Tutu rose to the stature of spiritual leader of the anti-apartheid movement. Yet his was a lonely, if principled, path, and he was vilified not only by the white government, but also by those who considered pacifism a weak weapon against oppression. By 1984, his unwavering crusade for simple justice had awakened the conscience of much of the world, and he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his call to the end of the all-white regime in South Africa. Within a decade, the nation held its first democratic, non-racial elections, and 80 years of white minority rule came to an end. The new parliament created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and turned to Archbishop Tutu, who had retired in 1996, to serve his country once again by heading the commission. Under the terms of its remarkable charter, the commission took an unflinching look at the crimes committed in the name of apartheid, offering forgiveness to human rights violators in return for the public disclosure of their crimes. Neither blanket amnesty nor criminal judgment, the process assisted in the transition of power that was both peaceful and healing. Bishop Tutu continues to offer a compelling voice on behalf of his countrymen. Most recently, he has helped focus world attention on the devastating march of AIDS across the African continent. The son of a teacher who became a teacher for all mankind, Archbishop Tutu's lessons of love and redemption are etched forever on our hearts. Your Grace, it is a distinct honor and privilege to welcome you to Georgetown University.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. President, Dean Galucci and Dr. Michael, all of you very distinguished ladies and gentlemen, friends, perhaps you might join me in a moment of silence as we remember September the 11th, those who were injured, those who died, those who were bereaved, those who have since died there and in other parts of the world. Thank you. And may I add my belated congratulations to you, Mr. President. I believe you are the first lay president of this splendid institution. Congratulations. I am very repetitive, totally unoriginal. And there's a story that is told of a brilliant professor of physics who used to give an outstanding lecture, the same lecture, mercifully not at the same venue. And one day he said to his driver, you know, I know that I gave a good lecture, but I'm getting a little bored listening to myself. And his driver said, well, actually, you know, I've heard your lecture so often, I know it off by heart. The professor said, not all your life. Try me, and he did. And the driver was word perfect. So they agreed to do an exchange. The driver would become professor and the professor would become driver. They laid down one of the ground rules was that there would be no time for questions after the lecture. And come this great day, and the driver turned professor delivered a scintillating address. Unfortunately, he left a little time over, And as you know, there are always those people who want to trip up lecturers. And so somebody got up and asked the most convoluted, abstruse question. And the driver turned, the professor said, "Oh, is that all? Even my driver at the back there can answer that question." It's a very great privilege to have been asked to deliver this, the second Oliver Tambo lecture at this prestigious institution. Most people know that the man whom this series of lectures seeks to honor was at one time a teacher and a partner in the law firm of Tambo and Mandela, the first black law firm in South Africa. What is less well known is that in 1960, the then Anglican Bishop of Johannesburg, the redoubtable Ambrose Reeves, had accepted Tambo, known by many as OR, as an ordinand to be trained for the priesthood. Alas, this was not to be, for the 21st March 1960 Shopville Massacre happened, when the South African police opened fire on defenseless civilians demonstrating against the much hated and iniquitous past laws that rigidly controlled the movement of blacks so that they could not move freely in the land of their birth. 69 persons, as you know, were killed on that infamous day, most having been shot in the back as they were running away, and several badly injured. In the aftermath of yet another of apartheid's atrocities against the indigenous disenfranchised population, the apartheid government declared a state of emergency, banning most of the black people's political organizations such as the Pan-African Congress, the PAC, and the African National Congress, the ANC. These went underground. The Anglican Church lost a potential priest as Tambo was asked to go into exile to head up the ANC abroad. I believe he continued to attend services of Holy Communion regularly, even on weekdays. This disciplined spirituality contributed very significantly to the ethos in the ANC that was to influence their conduct so crucially in the time of the negotiations before the 1994 election, and would be a critical factor in persuading the liberation movement to opt for reconciliation rather than retribution and revenge. I recall how in a meeting with OR in London at a friend's house, he and I celebrated Mass together. Thabo Mbeki, at the time his aide, was having a quiet smoke on his pipe outside. This side of Tambo's life weighed heavily in his favor when he met German church leaders to persuade them to support the ANC, something they were loath to do because they were unhappy with the armed struggle. When he spoke about his personal spiritual odyssey, he had them eating out of his hand. And I was very impressed with his almost pastoral concern and caring for others. When the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Ranci, arranged for me to be able to meet with OR in Lambeth Palace, Tambo sent word to inquire whether I was certain I wanted this to happen, because the South African government had made it an offense to have dealings with so-called terrorists. My way of handling this government prohibition was to announce before I left South Africa that I intended to meet with South African exiles. I said, how could we be expected to persuade them to change their minds about the armed struggle except through discussions with them? In any case, I would not permit anyone to dictate to me who my friends should be. And so we had our meeting in the Archbishop's official London residence. I recall too a dinner party hosted by the Secretary General of the Commonwealth in Marlborough House in London to honor the late Archbishop Trevor Huddleston, international president of the anti-apartheid movement and OR. They had collaborated closely in South Africa. At one point in the dinner, OR spoke, and I remember as if it were yesterday, him standing there in that sumptuous room, looking owlish and like some British university don, removing his glasses and saying quietly, "I am a terrorist." You could have heard the proverbial pin drop as the utter absurdity of the denigration by so many in power in South Africa could not have been more eloquently exposed. It is a great honor, therefore, to speak here today. This man's contribution has not always been properly acknowledged, or perhaps more correctly recognized. We would have been telling a different story about the political evolution in South Africa had it not been for his quiet but also telling contribution and influence. This is not the address I had intended making. I had hoped to use this platform to reinforce my plea for a special Marshall Plan-like strategy to assist Southern Africa to recover from the devastation visited on that subcontinent by apartheid, just as Europe was helped to get back on its feet after the destruction of World War II. I would have repeated my plea for a grant from the US of US $2 billion for 5 years to help us deal with the horrendous legacy of apartheid and to ensure that the miracle of our transition would persist and we would have a success story out of Africa. But September the 11th, the outrage that happened then, which we must all condemn roundly and unequivocally, made me decide to speak on our transition in South Africa and to ask whether any lessons for others could be learned from that process. Almost everyone believed that we were headed for Armageddon in South Africa. Violence was endemic. Things were so bad that when daily statistics on violence were published and on any particular day 5, 6, or even 10 people had been killed, we would sigh with relief and say, only 5 or 6 or only 10 people were killed. It did seem as if all those dire predictions about a ghastly race war of a bloodbath overwhelming us all were coming true. And then instead of being overtaken by a ghastly conflagration, the world watched with wonder and some awe as South Africans of all races stood in those long lines, snaking their way slowly to the polling booths when South Africa went to vote in its first democratic elections on April 27, 1994. The foreboding, the predictions were amazingly not fulfilled. Then the cynics and others declared that we should wait and see, for as sure as anything, as soon as a black-led government was in power, there would be an orgy of revenge and retribution. The blacks, for so long downtrodden and oppressed, would get their own back and wreak revenge on the whites who had made them suffer so grievously and so unnecessarily for so long. And then, instead of that much feared outbreak of vengeance, the world was amazed by the unprecedented Truth and Reconciliation process. Instead of paying for the blood of those who had oppressed them, the victims who should by rights have been consumed by bitterness and resentment exhibited a remarkable magnanimity and generosity of spirit in their willingness to forgive the perpetrators of some of the most gruesome atrocities against them. They were ready to consider forgiveness and reconciliation rather than punishment and retribution. It is 7 years since the extraordinary democratic elections and 3 years since the TRC handed over its 5-volume report to the then President Mandela. The extraordinary fact is that the arrangements that were negotiated to make these two events possible are still holding. The land is still enjoying a remarkable level of stability. Yes, there is violence, there is unemployment, poverty, and AIDS. But the violence is not political by and large. It is not something designed per se to subvert the newly established order. And when one looks at the level of social and economic instability in, say, the former Soviet Union, then you would say what we have in South Africa is like a Sunday school picnic in contrast. And what country does not have problems? But given our antecedents, would it not have been more likely to see children being escorted to school by armed security personnel? That scenario has been played out not as we would have expected in South Africa, but in Northern Ireland. You would not have been surprised had race riots erupted in South Africa. After all, our racist past made our country a prime site for such eruptions. And yet it has not been in South Africa that race riots have happened. No, unbelievably, it has been in Great Britain. It would seem something unusual did in fact take place in South Africa. Yes, we had a negotiated revolution leading to a relatively peaceful transition from the awfulness of racist oppression and injustice to a modern democracy. where the past was dealt with in a process that set high store by forgiveness and reconciliation, magnanimity and generosity rather than by retribution, resentment, and revenge. And why did it all happen? First, there can be no doubt at all about the critically important role played by our political leaders at the time. Had they been lily-livered and scared of going against the considerable populist current, and if they had merely pandered to the prevailing mood, then the chances would have been nearly non-existent for us to have attempted crossing that particular Rubicon. Mercifully for us, God raised up, as Esther had been, for just such times, an F.W. de Klerk and a Nelson Mandela to be at the helm. We can safely assert that had Mr. de Klerk's irascible and granite-like predecessor, Mr. P.W. Botha, been in charge, it is highly unlikely that we would have seen the epoch-making moves that Mr. de Klerk announced on February the 2nd, 1990. I myself could not quite believe my eyes and my ears as I watched him on television on that day, announcing those quite extraordinarily courageous initiatives. Whatever his motives then, and whatever one's feelings about his subsequent conduct, we have to doff our hats to him. He showed remarkable courage and has carved out, quite deservedly, a niche for himself in South African contemporary history. His role was quite indispensable. He put paid to all kinds of sacred cows in contemporary South African political discourse. But almost everyone would be quick to concede that had he had to deal with an intransigent, bitter, and vengeful counterpart, then it is highly unlikely that the entire process could have made first base. What a blessing with which God showered us when God raised Nelson Mandela, popularly referred to as Madiba, his clan name, at precisely this moment. Someone who had languished in jail for 27 years because he had had the temerity to claim that he and other black people were actually human persons with the same inalienable rights claimed and enjoyed by their white compatriots. Actually, languish is too negative a word, for in fact that time in jail was not wasted. He had gone to jail as an angry, frustrated young activist. In prison, the fires of adversity purified him and removed the dross. The steel was tempered. He learned to be more generous in his judgment of others, being gentle with their foibles. It gave him a new depth and serenity at the core of his being and made him tolerant and magnanimous even to a fault, more ready to forgive than to nurse grudges. Paradoxically, regal, for he comes of royal stock, and even arrogant, and yet at the same time, ever so humble and modest. Once, I asked him to appoint a judicial commission urgently because one of our TRC commissioners had serious allegations made against him. Judge Richard Goldstone, now of the Constitutional Court, acted very expeditiously and presented his report to the then President Mandela, who was aware just how anxious the particular commissioner would have been. The President's secretary called me to get the commissioner's contact numbers, and I told her to inform the President that I was quite upset, as I was the chairperson of the TRC, and I should have been the first to be told the judge's findings. Within minutes, Madiba was on the phone and he said, "Mpilo," which is my African name. "You're quite right. I'm sorry." Only a big man could be so humble as to ask for forgiveness from a small person. Mr. de Klerk could go ahead with his very courageous initiative because his counterpart was not vindictive, bitter, and resentful. It was not really popular to have done what these two leaders did. Anything but. On the white side, the intransigent wanted to dig their heels in and to fight to the last drop of blood. And we later discovered that there were arms caches buried in different parts of the country, and we were just a whisker away from the bloodbath that had been so widely predicted. And on the liberation movement side, there were those who believed that they could knock the stuffing out of the apartheid establishment and who were hell-bent on demanding their every pound of flesh. They wanted all the apartheid functionaries to be brought to book in a process of retributive justice akin to the Nuremberg trial. Mercifully for us, the 27 years gave Madiba an unassailable credibility. He could say, hey, let us forgive these guys. And no one could say, you're talking glibly about forgiving. What do you know about suffering? Well, he could have retorted, 27 years, you know. His moral stature and authority were and are impeccable and equally unassailable as the world has come to appreciate so adoringly. Wonderfully, it was not just he. He was the most spectacular example. But there were many others, such as the late Joe Slovo, the Jewish chairperson of the Communist Party, greatly admired in the black community. He sold to the radicals acceptance of the so-called sunset clauses that guaranteed that white officials in the apartheid dispensation would not be retrenched or lose their benefits with the advent of democracy and freedom. Or Chris Hani, whose assassination brought us to the brink of disaster and whose popularity was second only to that of Madiba, idolized as a communist leader of Umkhonto weSizwe, the ANC's armed wing, and who had been able to persuade the fire eaters among the young activists to agree to lay down arms and ending the armed struggle. Clearly, courageous leadership, ready to take risks and refusing to pander to populist demands, played a crucial and indispensable role in our transition. Second, perhaps I should have put this second factor at the top of the list. It is this, that the time was apt, just right. In Galatians, St. Paul uses a lovely phrase, in the fullness of time, when everything was in place, not a moment too soon, or it would have been premature, not a moment too late, for then it would be obsolete, anachronistic. It was that there had to be a Mikhail Gorbachev with his perestroika and glasnost. The so-called evil empire had to be disintegrated so that white apartheid South Africa could no longer hoodwink a gullible West about being the last bastion of Western civilization in Africa against the depredations of Soviet expansionism. This time coming too soon might have meant that Madiba would not have been quite as it turned out to be a little later. All happened in the fullness of time, at precisely that time and no other, the right time. And third, our people are quite marvelous. One has to say this with a huge dollop of modesty. They had a wonderful resilience and sense of fun. They laughed through the tears, as when the sun shines while it is raining. The apartheid system was vicious and did all it could to break the spirit of our people and to knock the stuffing out of them. I have not ceased to marvel at their strength in the face of the unspeakable viciousness and evil, as we had evidence of it all in the testimony before the TRC. Apartheid did its worst. It tightened the screws of repression quite viciously, and it created the climate that made possible the perpetration of some of the most horrendous atrocities. I was quite devastated myself by the revelations relating to the chemical, biological warfare program of the apartheid regime. It was all so cynical, all so clinical. White coats, subverting science to such evil purposes. For you see, we gather that they had intended poisoning Nelson Mandela whilst he was in prison so that his brain would be affected and he would forever after be disabled. Can you imagine what the consequences would have been had they succeeded? They nearly killed a Frank Chikane by dousing his clothes with an organic poison. He was saved miraculously almost because he happened to be visiting his wife who was studying at the University of Wisconsin, and somebody there was researching precisely those poisons. Frank Chikane today is the Director General in President Mbeki's office. The apartheid regime came up against a formidable adversary in our people, especially the women. Without them, we would not have had our freedom. One of our freedom chants declares, "Bota verwoord whoever." When you touch the women, you touch a rock. And we also had vibrant civic organizations that did not allow politicians free rein. Fourth, we did indeed win a spectacular victory over the awfulness of apartheid, but it is a victory that would have been quite impossible without the crucial support of the international community. It was especially young people, such as yourselves, obviously not they alone, at colleges and campuses, through their protests and demonstrations, as we have heard, happened on this campus, who forced the institutions to divest and helped to change the moral climate until a previously reluctant Congress passed the anti-apartheid legislation and mustered a presidential veto override to frustrate a White House opposed to sanctions against South Africa, preferring its own constructive engagement policy that had been so disastrous for the oppressed. Some of you were arrested, demonstrated, and rallied on our behalf. Even now, after all of these years, it continues to be a very great privilege to be able to say thank you on behalf of millions and millions and millions of my compatriots. We were oppressed. Now we are free, thanks to your support. And I usually say, well, you know, I wanted to give all of you a very warm hand, but it does look odd when I do it all by myself. And so I ask you, would you join me in clapping you and all of the other many people? Now, I have to say that really is lousy. I mean, that's a lousy applause. I know you are shy, but imagine that you are we. Imagine, I have a magic wand. I wave it over you. I turn you into South Africans. I wave it. Now, right, fellow South Africans, let us clap these. Thank you. Thank you. I bring you back to your former nice selves. We realized then, as we realize even now, just how much we need the rest of the world. No one is completely self-sufficient. Such a one would be an aberration, a contradiction, for we need one another since we're made for interdependence, for a delicate network of complementarity. What is true of individuals is true of nations. We were never meant to go it alone. To do so would be to flout a fundamental law of our being, and all kinds of things go horribly badly wrong. It's not my mother tongue. When we forget we are made for community, for family, for togetherness. We saw this playing out in our own recent history. We are democratic today because of the support of the rest of the world. And then next, we succeeded ultimately because this is a moral universe. Right and wrong good and bad matter. There is no way, ultimately, that evil can have the last word, that a lie can prevail over truth, that evil can in the end triumph over good. This is God's world, and God is in charge, despite all appearances to the contrary. We sometimes did wish we could have whispered in God's ear, God, we know you are in charge. For goodness sake, why don't you make it more obvious that you are in charge? And yet history provides ample evidence of the truth of this assertion. How many are the tyrants and despots who thought they ruled the roost, who have come a cropper and bitten the dust ignominiously? In recent times, Hitler, Mussolini, Amin, Marcos, Ceausescu, Pinochet, Milosevic, ad infinitum. They might indeed cause considerable havoc, but in the long run, which is the only run that matters, as someone put it, good is stronger than evil. Life is stronger than death. Light is stronger than darkness. And victory is ours through our Lord Jesus Christ, who has come, who has overcome death through dying and brought life and immortality into our reach. There is a nemesis in the scheme of things. You cannot flout the laws of the universe with impunity and hope to get away with it forever. And we have been given a precious gift to be morally responsible. Those with the freedom to choose to love or to hate, to obey or to disobey. It is a divine gift making us like God. And God, who alone has the perfect right to be a totalitarian, has such a deep respect for our relative autonomy that God had much rather we went freely to hell than compel us to go to heaven. And in this moral universe, nothing is useless. The sighs and groans of the persecuted and tortured, the courage and fidelity of the unremarked, the generosities and compassion that happen unsung, the heroisms often hidden. These do not just evaporate into the ether. No, they impregnate the atmosphere. You know, when you enter a happy home, you don't need to be told that this is so. You walk in, you can almost breathe it in the air, in the fabric. It is like a church too, that has been hallowed by much praying. You know it, you don't have to be told. It's there in the bricks and the mortar. It is unmistakable. And nothing is lost. All make a contribution, even the seeming failures. All. And in the fullness of time, it all comes to a head, and others enter into the labors of their predecessors. It is God's world. A God who watches patiently as it all unfolds, writing straight with crooked lines, as they say, adjusting God's plans according to our response, our waywardness, our recalcitrance. This God we were able to announce to our people is notoriously biased in favor of the weak, the hungry, and the oppressed. Our people exulted as we regaled them with stories of a God who was not deaf, a God who was not blind, a God who was not stupid, a God who heard their cry of anguish and knew their suffering, and as of old, God had come down to lead the rebel slaves out of bondage in Egypt, so God would one day come down and lead us from apartheid's bondage into the promised land of freedom and democracy. This God who did not give good advice from a safe distance. You see, God doesn't say, you see, guys, when you enter a fiery furnace, it would be wise to wear protective gear. No. Wonderfully, this God enters the fiery furnace and is there in the midst of it. sharing the anguish and the agony. For this is Emmanuel, God with us. This God who was not respectable, judging from the company God kept of the scum, the untouchables, the ostracized, the sinners, the prostitutes. The God whose standards were so low that God waited for the return of the lost as a father waited for a wayward prodigal, and gave a huge party for this one, whose son died for us while we were yet sinners. This God who upset the prim and the proper ones, not just to forgive those who ill-used them, but to bless them and not curse them, and startlingly, to love them. And so religion played a crucial role in our struggle and in that transition. And the faith communities and their leaders were prominent players in the struggle and contributed hugely to the ethos that evolved in our country. Madiba and other political leaders have been quite warm in the tributes they've paid to the different faith communities for their part in the struggle. When we marched in Cape Town in the mother of all marches in September 1989, the first in a series that mushroomed all over the country, I was arm in arm, figuratively, with a Jewish rabbi on one side and a Muslim imam on the other. No one denomination or faith community on its own could have accomplished what we did together. Christians are well aware, or should be, of the woeful record of Christianity, responsible for the Inquisition, for the burning of witches and heretics at the stake, for the obscurantism that sought to frustrate a Copernicus, a Galileo, and others, for the crusades that caused such bloody mayhem among Muslims. Fervent Christians supported slavery. It was Christians who supported Hitler in perpetrating the Holocaust in Germany. And it was decent Christians who were the most zealous supporters of apartheid. And it is Christians at one another's throats in Northern Ireland. And it was Christians who were involved in the recent Rwandan genocide. We are thankful for the cooperation of the different faiths in South Africa when we fought against apartheid, and we know that any faith is susceptible to subversion by extremist elements of one sort or another, and that this phenomenon should not be used to condemn all the adherents of that particular faith. We too, as Christians, know of extremists and have always declared that they do not represent the faith at its best. Prime Minister Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was, once dismissed Mandela as a terrorist. And of course, O.R. at that Marlborough House dinner I referred to, described himself as a terrorist, and the utter bizarreness of it was exposed. We discovered language is a very potent force. It does not just describe reality. Language creates the reality it describes. Hence the agitation of women against sexist language. It was thus often and often the appellation boxed a person in an unalterable identity. Far too frequently, one that dehumanized, demonized, as if that one was forever defined by their past. We would hear quite gruesome evidence before the TRC. And after that, you would hear people say, so-and-so was a monster or a devil. And we had to keep reminding people that the conduct of the person could indeed be described in the most trenchant manner. It could be defined as diabolical, as monstrous. Find whatever epithet you wanted. But we had to keep in mind that this one, guilty of such an atrocity, still remained improbably a child of God. A monster did not have moral responsibility, and so could not be held accountable for what had happened. But far more seriously was that we closed all possibility of change, that there was no hope. We declared that this one could no longer be rehabilitated, could not become better. If that were not the case, then the TRC process was pointless, for it was established on the premise that for confession, forgiveness, made possible the move towards a new dispensation where former enemies would be reconciled and become friends. It was to say human history is a closed system because it is deterministic, it is fatalistic, once thus forever condemned to be so. Mercifully, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ declares history to be open, that it is possible to be different, that we will be surprised at those we find in heaven, whom we didn't expect to be there. For ours is a faith of ever new beginnings. God, our God, gives up on no one. Language is potent. When we opposed apartheid's forced population removals of black people, especially the elderly, who were dumped in poverty-stricken Bantustan homelands, an apartheid cabinet minister, referring to those elderly, called them superfluous appendages. Our mothers, our fathers, our sisters, our brothers, people of flesh and blood, superfluous appendages. Perhaps we will pause to consider what we are about, how we would be appalled, and quite rightly so, were those who died on September the 11th to be described as collateral damage. We discovered as well that it is quite impossible to get true stability, true security, and peace through the barrel of a gun, through violence and might. We were surprised to find that in the end, it was not an eye for an eye, retributive justice, revenge, tit for tatting that gave birth to true security. We're even more amazed to discover that something so spiritual, so religious as forgiveness, as confession, this was not nebulous, reserved for the privacy of personal intercourse with one's deity, but that it all belonged in the realm of real politique, that getting one's own back, seeking to even the score, was a futile business, setting off an inexorable spiral of reprisal, provoking counter-reprisal, which in turn would provoke its own counter-reprisal endlessly. Reconciliation, forgiveness, seeing the other, even one's worst enemy, as still human, with possibilities of rehabilitation and changing for the better, that these were ultimately the only viable methods available. Violent reaction to the suicide bomber, who was to be condemned quite unequivocally, just seemed to give rise to further suicide bombers. That seems to be the case so distressingly in the Middle East, in Northern Ireland, in Kosovo. And so it's no facile, glib slogan to say, no future without forgiveness. It just happens to be the truth. God does have a huge sense of humor. Who could have imagined South Africa to be a sign of hope, an example of anything but the most awful ghastliness? Precisely. We were such an unlikely lot, and God chose to use us precisely because of that, that we were not over-virtuous. We would not have sustained such an evil system as apartheid for so long. And clearly, we were not too bright either. 2 South Africans came to the US, the story goes, and they fell foul of the law of they were guilty of some capital offense, and they were sentenced to death and then told you can choose the electric chair or or the rope. And the first South African went in and they threw the switch and nothing happened. This happened 3 times. And so they said, no, you are being reprieved. And so they untied him and he walks off free. And the next South African is in line, and the South African who has just been set free says, choose the rope, the damn thing doesn't work. It was so that God could point to us for all the world's troubled spots to see and say, you know, they had a nightmare called apartheid, it has ended, and yours too will end. They had a problem thought to be intractable. They are solving it. Nowhere can anyone ever again think that their problem was intractable. We were appalled as we listened to some of the testimony being given before the TRC, and we wondered how low human beings can sink, that all of us have an awful capacity for the most ghastly evil. But that just was one side of it. As we heard and saw people who had suffered grievously, not paying for the blood of their tormentors, but instead demonstrating this extraordinary magnanimity and generosity of spirit to forgive their tormentors, we were exhilarated and realized that we all have a wonderful capacity for good. You are wonderful people. You are warm-hearted, and you are generous to a fault. My family and I have experienced of that. When Leah and I were recovering from after surgery in Atlanta, our young Jewish neighbors from across the street were quite marvelous. They were psychiatrists, and she said she was our Jewish mama and would ply us with food parcels that she left on our doorstep, and often gave us what she called Jewish penicillin, chicken noodle soup. People have lent us their holiday homes on Californian beaches, and we could go on and on testifying to your extraordinary kindness. You are a great people. Many of us have been inspired by your history of a struggle to attain political independence, to aspire for our own freedom and democracy. The exploits, especially of African Americans in sport, in the arts, and in so many other ways, especially the civil rights movement, fired our imaginations and told of what we too could attain. Of course, you are now the only superpower in the world. Your economic and military power are undisputed, really. But that should not be the measure of your greatness. It should be because of your moral stature. It should be about what you do with your economic, military, and political might, about who you support and sponsor out there, whether they embrace the same values as you. It should be about what sort of policies you implement out there, whether it causes you anguish that unarmed civilians, little defenseless children, mothers and grandparents, just ordinary people, are being killed as at the present time, and whether your country's policies cause God's children out there considerable suffering. It should be about sharing your enormous influence and your political and social values of justice, freedom, and equity, that there is a place in the sun for all. How gratifying that so many voices in this land are being raised at this time to say, America, let us engage in serious introspection, in self-appraisal. This is an opportunity for a hard look at ourselves. That way lies the way to true greatness. You and I are made for goodness, for love, for transcendence, for togetherness. God, too, has a dream that we, God's children, would come to realize that we are indeed sisters and brothers, members of one family, God's family, the human family. That all belong, all, white, black, yellow, rich and poor, beautiful and not so beautiful, young and old, male and female, that there are no outsiders, that all are insiders, gay and straight, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Arabs, Americans, Protestants, Roman Catholics, Afghans, all belong. And God says, I have no one to help me realize my dream except you. That we were made for goodness, were made for love, were made for laughter, were made for joy, were made for transcendence. There's a wonderful African story of a farmer who in his backyard has a strange-looking chicken. It behaves like the other chickens, but it doesn't quite look like these other chickens. And then somebody comes along who knows these things and says, oh no, man, that's no chicken, that's an eagle. And the farmer says, ah? And the visitor says, just give me that strange-looking chicken. And he takes it. And he walks very early in the morning and goes to the top of a mountain and turns the eagle towards the rising sun and say, fly, eagle, fly. And the little bird shakes itself, spreads out its pinions, and lifts off, and soars, and disappears away into the distance, the rising sun. God says to us, hey, you are not chicken, you are an eagle. Fly, eagle, fly. And God expects us to shake ourselves, to spread out our pinions, to lift off, to soar, and fly. For we are made for transcendence, for goodness, for laughter,